talking about dolphin, well, we should probably talk about this dolphin here in a little bit more detail. The most famous dolphin in our area, the orca whale. The orca whale, again, it's not a whale, it's a dolphin because they have cone-shaped teeth. Orca whales, they live all around the world. Now, orca whales, they travel in groups, and the groups are called pods. Every pod, they get a letter. Like there's the A pod, and they live up in Alaska. Then each family member gets a number. Like there's like A17. That's this individual that's been identified as number 17 in the A pod. I'll get you more on that in a minute. See, orcas, they're big. They're about 20 to 24 feet big. They weigh 8,000 pounds. Now, what I want you to know is that no two orca whales are the same. Like I said, that one that's A17. How do they know that it's A17? By two ways. Every orca whale is different in that they all have a different dorsal fin, and they all have a different white spot on their back. Some orca whales' dorsal fin is almost straight up and down. Some of them have a little bend to them. Some orca whales, their dorsal fin is huge. Other ones, their dorsal fin is tiny. Some orca whales, they have like a little notch, like right here. This one has a little notch in it. Some of them have a couple notches. There's the white spot. It's either like all white or a little off-white with a little black stripe. But anyways, that's how you identify an orca whale as a specific individual. Now, there's two different types of orca whales. There's resident orca whales, and then there's transient orca whales. Let me talk about the resident. The resident orca whales, they eat salmon. They just go around and they eat salmon. That's what they do. Resident orca whales, they travel in large pods and they talk a whole lot, because they're dolphins. They're clicking and squeals. The pods are controlled by the oldest female. The oldest female controls the pod. It tells the pod where to go. Like here in the Puget Sound, there's 3 pods of resident orca whales that call the Puget Sound their home. There's the J pod, and the J pod is normally found around San Juan Island. I mean, they usually, almost all the time, hang out at San Juan Island. It's called the J pod. Now, if they're not at San Juan Island, maybe they'll swim out to Vancouver Island. Maybe they'll venture up to Alaska a little bit. But then they go back usually around San Juan Island. Sometimes they come down to Whidbey Island. But they were controlled by Granny. Granny was born in 1911. Granny died 2 years ago. Granny died in 2018. Granny lived to be 107 years old. Now, when Granny died, the next oldest female then took over the pod. Now, when they take over the pod, they changed the dialect of the orca whale language up there. Instead of going, it's more like, so she'll change the dialect, and then they'll all start speaking like her. The L pod, they come in the Puget Sound, but when they're not in Puget Sound, they're in California. I mean, when there's a whole bunch of salmon in the Puget Sound, the L pod comes up to the Puget Sound, and they start eating the salmon. But when the salmon aren't coming in the Puget Sound, well, then they'll venture around. Usually they go down to California, but then they come back up. The next one is the K pod. The K pod, when they're not found in Puget Sound, are normally found in Alaska. They'll go up to Alaska, but then they'll come down into the Puget Sound, around San Juan Island, and eat some salmon around there. Sometimes when there's a whole lot of salmon coming through around this in the summer, all 3 of these pods will be in the Puget Sound. You're going to see a whole bunch of orca whales, which are really dolphin. Gotta tell you about a couple stories. Springer. For some reason, the A pod came into the Puget Sound. I told you, the A pod is normally found up in Alaska. Well, the A pod came into the Puget Sound. They were eating some salmon. And they were about Whidbey Island. They were eating some salmon. And then they turned around Whidbey Island and started going back out north. Well, Springer was a 2-year-old female. She didn't get the message. she kept swimming south. She lost her pod. The pod went north. She went south. She kept swimming until she got to downtown Seattle. She must have been lonely. Because then what she started doing is she started following the ferry from Bainbridge Island to Seattle. She'd swim right alongside of it. And she'd hang out there while it loads up, and then she'll swim back to Bainbridge Island. She kept doing this. And then she'd go up to other boats. Oh, everybody was heartbroken. Springer, she's from the A-pod. She lost her pod. Oh, we gotta do something. Otherwise, the boat's going to hit her. It took us a long time to kind of figure out a plan. What should we do? What should we do? We got to help Springer. Well, what they did is it was a resident orca whale. They eat salmon. So what they did is they got a salmon on a rope. Springer, get the salmon. And then they commandeered a salmon farm net. They brought it next to the salmon farm. Then they said, Springer, get the salmon. And went and followed the salmon. And then they closed the net behind Springer. Yes, we got Springer. Now, what are we going to do with Springer? Well, sometimes pack animals, what they do is they kick out another one if it's been infected. If it has a disease or if it's sick, they kick it out of the pack so it doesn't infect everybody else. Was Springer sick? Marine biologists went, they took blood samples and tissue samples, and it took them a couple weeks just to analyze that, and they found out that Springer was completely healthy. So they said, okay, should we do it? Let's do it. So they took a tugboat, and they slowly tugged this whole net. They tugged the whole net, and now the A-pod was up by Vancouver Island. Well, did Springer get kicked out of the A-pod because it broke orca law? And then if you reunite Springer with the A-pod, would the whole pod turn on side on Springer and kill Springer in front of everybody's eyes? So we didn't want that to happen. So we let Springer out a couple miles away, and just to see what happened. Springer heard the A-pod calling. Springer quickly swam over to the A-pod. Springer was reunited with the A-pod. It worked. Last year, Springer became a mom for the first time. All because of us. Yes. Well, Luna was a 2-year-old, just like Springer, boy from the L-pod. The L-pod, well, they be going to the Puget Sound. Well, they were leaving the Puget Sound. They went by Vancouver Island. Then they went to this one little inlet. It's called the Nooksack Sound. And I went into the Nooksack Sound, and the pod left, and Springer didn't get the message. Same story. Luna was lonely. Luna started going up to all these boats, and I had lost my picture. I had a picture of it. Luna started going up to all these boats and like following these boats, and it would come up to everybody's boats, and they would pet it. It was like Luna. They said, well, we got to capture Luna, just like the Americans did. And I said, well, let's just wait. It's the L-pod. They'll come back. Well, they waited for 1 year, and the L-pod didn't come back. They waited for 2 years, and the L-pod didn't come back. Man, we got to do it. We got to do what the Americans did. So they got a salmon. Luna, here we go. They got a big net. Luna, come on, follow it. Now, this is where the story gets confusing. Because in the Nooksack Sound, I'm not going to call them Native Americans because they're from Canada. I'll call them First Nations people. There was the First Nations tribe that they had a chief. And the chief said, when I die, I'm going to come back as an orca whale. Oh, great chief, whatever. Well, he died. The next day, Luna showed up. Oh, it's our chief. Chief, you were serious. And they get in their canoes and they go rowing. And then Luna would come up. It would roll over on its belly. They'd scratch its belly. Oh, Chief, you wouldn't believe what happened at camp today. This is it kept happening. Well, the First Nations people, they saw that the Canadian government was trying to capture Luna. They go, no, that's our chief. So they got in their canoes. They started rowing out there. No, that's our chief. They started banging on their canoes. Luna was following the salmon into the net. And then Luna heard the canoes and turned and went, oh, said the Canadian government. And this went on for months. Every time the Canadian government tried to lure Luna in, the First Nations people would lure him out. It went on and on and on. Finally, the Canadian government, they threw up their hands, said, you can have your chief. But you know what? It's not your chief, it's Luna. Look at the dorsal fin, look at the pattern. I don't want to tell you a sad story, but I think I have to. A tugboat came in. Luna had a habit of going up to the boat. I need a moment. Man, I was driving home. I remembered I forgot to tell you about transient orca whales. I don't like transient orca whales. Transient orca whales, they eat mammals. Like they're the ones that hunted down the baby gray whale, jumped on its back and drowned it, and only ate the tongue of the gray whale. They only eat mammals. They travel in small pods and they don't talk a lot. They do come into the Puget Sound. They'll come into the Puget Sound in a group of like 4 or 5. And you know what they're looking for? Seals, sea lions, other mammals, porpoises. You?